Hello, everyone. Frank and I just finished recording episode 6 of season 2, in which we cover the longest time prophecy in history, known as the 2300-day prophecy. You're about to watch that episode, and I just want to encourage you to take some time to study this outside of this video. Normally, we teach this prophecy over the course of hours, if not days, not just minutes. And so there's a lot more to get into it. If there was things that were confusing, please go ahead and ask your questions in the comments below. We will try to answer those. We have materials that we can send to you. So if you send a note wanting more materials on this subject, we can send you materials to help you understand this longest prophecy in the Bible, known as the 2300-day prophecy. I thank you for watching. You're going to have to be patient. We do a little bit of rambling in this one, but in the end, I think it'll begin to open your eyes to some things, and hopefully, most of all, it'll help you to understand who our God is, that He gave us these prophecies so that we could know the times in which we're living, and we would be reminded that now is the time to be right and to walk with Jesus. Enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome back to Biblical Perspectives with Frank and Chad. This is season 2, and this is episode 6. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, you can go to the Spencerville Church YouTube channel and find all of the episodes there. You can also find season 1 there, in which we talked about how to manage money according to God's plan and the biblical principles. Frank, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Chad.
We are, in these next 7 episodes, I think we have, or 8 episodes we have, we are going to be getting into some pretty intense conversation.
Yes, biblical content, but it will be a challenge.
So I encourage you to pay close attention. By the way, we're going to give an overview of some things here. There are 2 chapters in this book, which I offered the other day, The Great Controversy. If you don't have it and you'd like a copy, simply send a note to the email that is on the screen now, and we will make sure that you get a free copy of this book. But in that book, there are 2 chapters, What is the Sanctuary and Holy of Holies, that discuss what we are going to talk about today. And so I encourage you to get that book. If there's anything that's not as clear today, and just let us know, we'll be happy to send you a free copy of that book. So Frank, we are looking at the section of the Bible in this season known as the 3 angels' messages. And even though we're dealing with that, we have to look at other parts of the Bible to understand aspects of the 3 angels' messages. And that is the case today. We're looking at the phrase that comes in the very first angel's message, where the angel says in a very loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to Him," which we covered in a previous episode. "For the hour of His judgment has come." Now, we as Seventh-day Adventists believe that we are living in this judgment hour. But when John spoke these words, that judgment hour had not yet come. We have that understanding based on another prophecy, Revelation chapter 12, the 1260-day prophecy, that gives us some insight into that. And we're going to look at that in a later episode, so come back for that. But if we're living in the hour of judgment, how do we know when that judgment hour began, that time period began, Frank? Where should we turn to understand that?
Well, that's a good question, Chad. But there are several indicators, I think, that can help us find an answer to that particular question. One actually is in the chapter itself, in chapter 14. So, and in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, John prophetically basically outlines events from the day where he lived till the end of times, when Jesus will come back again. And so there's a historical progression, so to speak, throughout the book, and a repetition of historical and symbolic events that he talks about. But here in this chapter, the message of the 3 angels comes before the harvest of the earth. We talked about that earlier.
Yes, we did.
2 harvests. So this judgment hour apparently happens before the harvest, before
Just before the harvest.
the end, the final judgment. So that already is an indicator in the chapter itself that this judgment hour has to be happening prior to the final judgment, to the reaping event. But to really understand better the time frame of what we are talking about here, you have to understand that the book of Revelation is closely connected to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. You cannot understand the book of Revelation without the book of Daniel. Daniel has symbolic images that are taken up in the book of Revelation again, and Revelation unfolds things that are started in the book of Daniel. And so to really understand what he is talking about and when that time for the judgment hour came or is coming, you need to go back to the Old Testament.
Okay.
Because the New Testament builds on the Old Testament. And Daniel and Revelation are two books that the scholars, the theologians, call apocalyptic literature.
As we say here in the United States, apocalyptic.
Yes, right. Thank you. And that really tells events throughout Earth history that deal and end with the final return of Jesus Christ then.
So Daniel and Revelation are connected. In order to really understand Revelation, we need to understand Daniel, and probably vice versa. They both have connection to each other. So where in Daniel do we go then to begin to understand this time period known as the hour of judgment?
Well, actually, we should go to Daniel 8. Probably there is a reference to the longest prophetic time span in the entire Bible, the 2,300 evenings and mornings or days.
And you're talking about Daniel 8:14.
8:14.
Should I read that for us?
Please.
Daniel here has an angel that visits him, basically a messenger visit him, and the angel says to him, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, we refer to this as the 2,300 days prophecy, but what does that 2,300 days actually represent, Frank?
Well, it's not just literal days. And there are indicators in the chapter itself and in the book of Daniel itself.
Yep.
And also the broader context of the book. You know, if you read Daniel, and Daniel 8 really comes after Daniel 7, comes after Daniel 2. And if you read those chapters, Daniel 2, Daniel chapter 7, you see Daniel 8 builds on the same images in chapter 7, unfolds them in greater detail, brings new information about developments that will take place at the end of time and throughout history that affect the people of God. And so you really, to understand Daniel 8, you have to go to Daniel 7 and start there.
Okay.
We don't have the time now to go into the details, but then Daniel 9 builds on something that is mentioned in Daniel 8. And so these chapters in Daniel are really interconnected and should not be isolated.
So I want to say then to our watchers and our listeners, hear what Dr. Frank just said. You need to study Daniel 7, 8, and 9 to get the bigger picture. We're going to give you a little bit of outline, but 7, 8, and 9 are connected. You need to get that. But you indicated that within the text of Daniel itself, there are some indications that this is not talking about the 2,300 literal days. And one of the indicators of that is in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 17, because when Daniel has this vision, and the vision is quite startling because it's pointing to obviously some major event. And Daniel's thinking, 2,300 days, we only have 2,300 days to get ready. And the angel says to Daniel, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. In other words, taking place in the last days of Earth's history. When we think about that, Daniel wrote what, early 400 BC?
Or 600.
Or, 600, sorry, we go backwards, I forget. Yeah, 600 BC. So he wrote at that point in time, which we've gone a few thousand years since the time of Daniel now. So this is speaking of.
Yeah, there's another indicator. You're absolutely right. So verse 17 is the first indicator within the context of the chapter. At the end of the chapter, in verse 26, the angel again refers to the vision of the evenings and mornings that we have just read, that has been told is true. And he says, but seal up that vision, for it refers to many days from now. So if you were to take the 2,300 days, evenings and morning, in the Bible, evening and morning constitutes a day. So in Genesis 1, there was evening and morning, day 1, evening and morning, day 2. And so evening and morning is a day. So is the 2,300 evenings and mornings, the 2,300 days, are they literal days or are they prophetic days?
Yeah.
So that's the question, because if you take them as literal days, you have just a couple years. Yep. It will not lead you to many days, as the text.
And it definitely won't lead you to the end of time.
Definitely will not lead you to the end of time.
Because if you interpret this as a literal 2,300 days, then this prophecy is already completed, and then the angel is false about the time of the end, because the time of the end has not yet come, right?
Exactly.
So it's towards the time of the end. So we have these indicators in the text. That's good. Now we've been saying they're not literal. So if they're not literal days, what are they then?
Well, we believe that the whole context of chapter 7, chapter 8 is very symbolic. You have images of lions with and leopards with horns and with wings and several heads and things that are really not the natural way, so to speak, where you get the impression that God uses symbolic images to convey historical truth.
Yeah.
And so since the whole context is that symbolic, we think that we have reason to believe that these days are symbolic days as well and not literal days.
And there is some biblical precedence for this. There are some scriptures in the Bible that indicate that this is a principle. We can look at Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6, which says, and when you have completed these, is talking to the prophet Ezekiel, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah 40 days. I assign you a day for each year. So here there was a prophetic message going to God's people, and he's saying 40 days, and each day represents a year.
Yes.
Numbers chapter 14 and verse 34, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days. This is the story of when the Israelites go in to Jericho and they spy out the land, the promised land that God had promised them for 40 days, but they end up not trusting God to give them deliverance in that land. And so God says, for each day that you spied out the land, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years. So in other words, as a symbol of the day, it equals 1 year.
Yes. Well, thank you for mentioning those two passages. These are the two passages that indicate exactly what you said, that in the Bible you have examples where biblical writers themselves say that a day equals a year, and
in God's prophetic
symbolism. Now, these two passages are not the only passages that lead us to that conclusion.
Give me more then.
I brought a book with me. It's called Selected Studies on Prophetic Interpretation, and it is written by William Shea. He was a Bible scholar, and he has 2 chapters in that book that deal with biblical evidence for this year-day principle. And he lists many, many more examples beyond the two that you just mentioned that illustrate that this was a principle that is firmly established in Scripture. And that is not something that people make up, but that is something that you find in many places in Scripture. And he gives evidence after evidence after evidence in that. And so if you are interested to study that particular subject closer and more in depth, I would recommend that you have a look at that particular book, and especially those two chapters where he deals with the year-day principle.
Also, Frank works for the Biblical Research Institute. Their job is to study difficult passages and to give some insights into those. And you can go to that website, and actually on that website, the Biblical Research Institute website, which is on your screen right now, you can find articles specifically also explaining this, and articles by Dr. Shea as well.
Yes.
So,
in fact, he also worked for the Biblical Research Institute for many, many years.
well before your time. You are much younger than he. So, we believe that the 2,300 days is 2,300 literal years. So when does this time period start? Because the angel said it's for the time of the end. It's many years from now, but it has to have a beginning point.
Yes, well, the prophecy and that statement in Daniel 8:14 doesn't tell us that particular reference point. But if we continue in chapter 9,
Okay.
you'll see that in chapter 9, verse 24, there is another prophecy given by the same angel.
Yep.
And it deals about 70 weeks that are set apart about your people and the holy city.
And the word there, set apart, or in the Bible I'm reading, the English Standard, it says decree. It literally means cut off. So in other words, this 70 weeks is a part of something else. It's cut off from something else. And since the previous prophecy was 2,300 days, we believe that it has to be that reference, because the angel's coming to explain the 2,300 days prophecy to Daniel, and he says 70 weeks of this prophecy is cut off.
Cut off. And the only reference point for that cutting off really is the previous 2,300 evenings and mornings. So that has to be connected. Now, in the next verse, this is a prophecy that talks about the coming of the Messiah, who will make an end to sin, who will atone for iniquity, etc. And then it says in verse 25, "Know, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, the Messiah, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks. It shall be built again at squares and mowed, but in a troubled time." So here we have a historical reference point that can help us determine when this prophecy started. It started with a word to restore and build Jerusalem.
And that is referenced in the book of Ezra, right? In the book of Ezra, chapter 7, 7:13.
And 27.
"I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you." And then what verse again? 27. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem." So this is the decree of Artaxerxes.
Yes, and it actually was given in the fall, in autumn of 457 BC. Okay. So we can trace that historically, and
so we have the historical evidence that this decree went out in 457 BC.
And if you take that as a starting point of that particular statement in Daniel 9, it will give you also the starting point of the 2,300 days.
Okay.
Because the 490
and we'll put a chart up on the screen here so you can kind of see some of this. Go ahead.
You'll see that it is cut off, and that's the starting point. So it's cut off from the beginning, and then you'll have the rest of that 2,300 prophecy. And
so the first
many years.
So the first 70 weeks are for
God's people.
God's people. So Israel at the time, right? He says, for your people. So that's, Daniel was a Jew. He was an Israelite. So 70 weeks times 7 times 7, 70 weeks is 7, each week is 7 days. So 70 times 7 is 490 days. And then we do the year-day principle, so that's 490 years. So it begins in 457, and we go 490 years. And in that time, we know that Jesus came at the 6-7 weeks. Jesus came, and he was anointed at his baptism. You can read about all this. The dove came down. This is my son, with him I'm well pleased. We know that he was then crucified on the cross. He put an end to sin, right? He overcame sin. Obviously, there's still sin in the world, but he overcame the power of sin through the cross. The Bible tells us in the book of Mark that when he was killed and sacrificed, that the veil tore, and the temple tore from top to bottom without hands, symbolizing the end of the sacrifice. So we understand some of these various things. And then there was another 3 years, and then Stephen was stoned, and this constitutes the first 490 years when Israel shut their eyes to Christ's messiahship. And I encourage you to read more about that. We can't get into all that. But then it moves forward into the next 2,300, to the rest of the 2,300 days from that time period. And where does it take us?
Well, if you count then the rest, 1,810 years, you end up, and the year 0 actually did not exist, so to speak. You have to take that into consideration. But it leads you basically from AD 34, where the 490 years end, to the year 1844.
That prophecy ends in 1844. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, it says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. What does that language have to do with judgment?
Well, in the Old Testament, in Israel, you had the sanctuary, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then the temple later on. And God had given Israel instructions on how it is possible that a holy God can live in the midst of sinful people. And this whole system of sacrificing animals, and the idea that the blood that is being shed will atone for the sins of those who have confessed their guilt and their sins. This ended in the Day of Atonement. Once a year, at the end of the liturgical year in Israel, so to speak, then the sanctuary was cleansed. Then all the sins that had been committed into God's care, so to speak, were removed from the sanctuary.
And it was literally cleansed as a metaphorical symbol. Like there was a lot of sacrifices that day, and then it was all washed out symbolically. I mean, there was truly everyone came.
It was a time of where every person kind of reflected on his life, made sure that you would be in harmony with God, and that you had committed everything into his hands, and not be cut off from his...
And on this particular day, the high priest went into what is known as the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the compartment of the sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the commandments were kept, where Aaron's rod was kept. This is where that priest would enter into that compartment to symbolically be the representative for the people there in that quote-unquote time of judgment. And this was referred to as the cleansing of the sanctuary.
Yes.
And so now we're talking about a prophetic aspect of a cleansing of a sanctuary. So it is a day of judgment. In fact, the Bible tells us that if anyone did not show up on the Day of Atonement, then they were cut off from the camp. They were to be cast out, no longer welcome as the children of Israel. That's how serious it was. It was a judgment day. in which people were to examine their hearts and
Humble themselves.
before God.
Yes.
So now we come and we say, okay, at the end of these 2,300 days, 1844, we are now living in that time of judgment.
And we are also called to humble ourselves, to commit our lives fully to God, so that He can take care of our sins and give and provide the forgiveness that He has attained on the cross. He makes that available to us. And now that He lives in the heavenly sanctuary, as the writer to Hebrews tells us, so He applies what He has done for us on the cross for our daily lives to enable us to live victoriously.
So even though we're living in the time of judgment, there is still availability to come to God.
And even in the Old Testament, even on the Day of Atonement, there was a sacrifice, the sacrifice, indicating in the morning and in the evening that constant forgiveness of God was available. So that continues until the very end. But there comes an end where God will put an end to iniquity and to sin and cleanse this world and everyone, from what sin has done.
But the Bible indicates that there's this judgment period, and then the end comes. That's it. And so that's why this three angels message is so significant and to be preached in this time, because it's God's final warning to humanity to leave the world and to follow Him, because we're living in, we call it the hour of judgment, but really what we're saying is we're living in the last days. Yes. Since 1844, we've been living in those last days.
If you look at these prophetic statements in the book of Daniel, it becomes if you look at Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and then Daniel 8 repeats the same sequence, you see that it paints a picture of world history related to the people of God from the time where Daniel lived to the very end when Jesus will come back again. Mm-hmm. We don't live in the time of the Babylonians. We don't live in the time of Rome. We don't live in the time of Persia or Alexander the Great. We live at the very end of earth history. We don't know when Jesus will come back again, the time and the hour of His coming. But we can tell by the sequence of these time prophecies that we are living not at the beginning of that, but at the very end. And that should make us aware that it gives meaning to our existence, really. We know where we live, and it gives urgency to what we do, and it helps us to live a life fully consecrated to God.
Now, Frank, I don't think we can leave this subject without addressing the fact that the majority of Christendom teaches that the 2,300 days means something else. And can you address that briefly? And I know we've had some writing.
Yes, well, really there are two kind of worldviews that clash here. One is that people believe that God genuinely is able to predict the future and to reveal what is going to happen in the future. There are other people who have more a closed understanding of the world that is only immanent within world history without any ability of God supernaturally penetrating that and providing information that otherwise we would not be able to have. Now, if you're in that closed continuum of natural causes and effects, there are no miracles, there is no supernatural revelation, and there is nothing like prophetic statements that will reveal what will take place in the future. So for them, and this is basically modern critical scholarship at large, and that has infiltrated most of the churches today and most of the interpreters and commentaries of the Bible today. So they would not think that Daniel, made this prediction in 600 years BC, pointing in the future to the end when Jesus will come back again. They don't believe in that prophetic ability of God.
That expansive ability.
So they will have to find an explanation for that within the context of normal human history. And for them, this means they're looking for an event that could explain something like that that has to do with the power of the so-called little horn that we read about in Daniel chapter 7 and then also in Daniel chapter 8. And they believe that this was written in the year 200 something BC, when Israel was in a crisis situation, and where Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Seleucid successors, desecrated the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And they tried to interpret all these references that we just read in Daniel 9 and Daniel 8 to this particular leader. But if you study history and you know who this man was, you realize that it doesn't just quite match up and fit the text of what the Bible tells us. He was not a person that came to great power as the little horn that became big is portrayed. He didn't reign for 2,400 days. His reign was shorter, It just doesn't match quite up to the historical facts. And for that reason, we in the Adventist Church believe that this is not something that was written subsequent to the events, but that is a real prophecy that is given ahead of.
Now, there's a great little, in a book that you have there on your lap, there's a chart in this book. Can you hold that book up?
Yes.
And if people want to get this book, we'll put a link in the...
There's the New Andrew's Bible Commentary. This is volume 1 on the Old Testament. There's a second volume.
And we get no money by promoting this.
No, and in there you have, in the book of Daniel, you have, this is on page 1039, a nice little diagram comparing the little horn in Daniel 8. We didn't talk about that yet. And Antiochus the Fourth. And it just compares the two, and it makes very clear that he is not the fulfillment of the biblical description of the little horn. Yeah.
If you want that book, there's a link in the notes, the show notes below the video. We've covered a lot, Frank. One of the things that I think is really key, though, that you said in that last bit that I want to touch on is really understanding the 2,300 days either as something that you try to force into the scope of what has already happened in history, or whether you see it off as something in the future, is about your perception of how big God is. If you're someone that says, you know what, I don't think God can see beyond my front door or beyond tomorrow or beyond today, then you have to find a history moment to try to make it fit. And what you end up finding is, as you'll look at, if you get that book and you look at that chart, you'll find that it doesn't fit. But because it's rational, you make that. We have to understand that the things of God are beyond us. I mean, as the Bible says, faith is the evidence of things hoped for, things unseen. There is an aspect, as we study Bible prophecy, as we think about the 2,300-day prophecy, there is an aspect of faith that we must take in this journey. And we believe that the evidence points to this idea that in 457 BC, as we show on the chart, this prophecy began. It prophesied after 490 years that Jesus would come just as he did come. It prophesied that he would be baptized, anointed as the Messiah, just as he was anointed. It prophesied that he would be crucified, that he would overcome sin just as it took place. It prophesied that Daniel's people, the Israelites, would close their hearts to the gospel, and that the system would at least close their hearts to the gospel, and that then the gospel would spread out from there, which it did when the stoning of Stephen came. The Bible in the book of Acts says that when Stephen was stoned, that the believers scattered out of Jerusalem and the gospel went everywhere. All of these predictions came true just as the Bible said they would. The last prediction is the timing of when the judgment hour begins. I'm not a gambler, but if I were a gambler and I said, Christ was right here, Christ was right here, Christ was right here, Christ was right here, or the scriptures were accurate here, then I'm going to trust that probably that fifth point is accurate as well for me.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we want to encourage you to take some time to look at that and study that more. But this is why this message is so important, because we are living in this time of atonement, this time to be at one with God, to not let anything else distract us, but to keep our eyes focused on Jesus Christ, and to allow him to examine our hearts, and to allow him to be our sacrificial lamb, and to stand with him. Frank, do you want to say anything before we close?
No, I think you made a good point. I'll leave it at that.
I'm sorry, this one was a little bit longer than our most, but we had a lot to cover. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments notes. We promise you, we will answer your questions. We're not going to get into a big debate, but we will answer your questions to the best of our ability. So go ahead and put those in the notes. And if you like this, please give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.